That's a really good and big question. It seems to me on home education that there is some of it where parents actually do want to educate their children at home, although not necessarily for reasons that not for reasons that I wish they weren't having the reasons they're looking at. I think some parents are finding that the SATs in primary schools and the change in the secondary curriculum is making education not that they don't think their child is getting on well in school. So some parents are taking their children out of school because school has become a bit less welcoming to children, especially those who have a few more needs. So there's some parents taking their children out in that sort of way, and then others, I think as your question implies, there are people who are home educating their child because their child has been excluded from school. And I think there's at least two ways that I'd want to say something about that. School has become a bit harder because of the SATs and because of the GCSE curriculum. Maybe some examples of that. 2 years ago, when all the 11-year-olds in the country did their SATs exam, schools had to write to 48% of all the parents in the country telling the parents that their children weren't ready to go to secondary school. The government the government changed the SATs curriculum, changed the way we assessed the papers, and we had to write to any parent of a child who didn't pass a certain grade in three of the SATs papers, any of the three of the SATs papers, and tell them their children weren't ready to go to secondary school. And I tell you, that's a really weird thing to do, because it was just before the children were going to secondary school. So just before the summer holiday, before they went off and start the secondary school, we had to write to parents and say, your child's not ready to go to secondary school. Now that will do your head in for many children, putting them in that position. So, and the same thing with the GCSEs. We've made the GCSEs so tough. The mark schemes are really weird. So 2 years ago, to get an equivalent of a grade C in maths, it's now called a 4, the pass mark for that was 17%. We'd made the exams so hard, and then we said, actually, we're going to have roughly the same number of kids getting a 9 has got an A star, roughly the same number of kids going to get a C as get a grade 4. We made them so hard to get roughly the same number of kids. Yeah. The pass mark was 17%. So for that child who was getting a grade C in maths, their experience was 83% of the paper they couldn't do. And what does that do to you? So that makes it really tough, I think, for some young people. And then at the same time as we've made that so much harder, at the very same moment, we've got far less support for young people. So school counsellors have gone, social workers linked to schools just disappeared, mental health services not there for children, and in that circumstance, you end up with some more children acting out. Some of them get excluded. And I think there's maybe one other thing to say about exclusions as well. We're currently doing some research with the Education Policy Institute about this idea of off-rolling that I think you mentioned in the question. This is where some children start at a school and aren't there when the GCSEs happen. They have been moved out of the school, and sometimes it's clear that that's because the school is managing its league table position. It's getting out of the school children that wouldn't look good in the league tables. We think that's much more in some of the academy trusts than in other schools, although other schools are not immune from that, and it comes out of league table pressures. So I think school has become more horrible for children. Some parents are taking their kids out of that. It's become more horrible for some children, and therefore they're acting out, and we haven't got the support services. They end up getting excluded, and some children are being off-rolled to manage a school's league table position, and all those things we have to change.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Do you want to take up this one? I heard you.
Oh God, did you hear me sigh? I thought I didn't realise I did that out. It's where to begin. Okay, so start with homeschooling. I think it's really important to say that some parents choose to homeschool and are able to do that really, really well. So this isn't about all parents that homeschool. But I have a real concern and issue if a parent takes their child out of school and feels that they need to homeschool them because they're worried about them getting excluded. That is a real concern, and that shouldn't be happening. I think there's a challenge as well, because it's how we monitor exclusions, because I think not all of exclusions are monitored. So you can have as many internal exclusion as you like, but actually that's not really recorded. So while I think in the borough exclusion is improving, it's how we monitor all exclusions and what that looks like. So you talked about why do we think it's happening. There's lots of reasons. A lot of the support from schools has been removed, as Kevin said. All of the support staff and a lot of the support staff that would have supported children that have challenging needs or need to have support in managing their behaviour isn't there in schools in the same way. When I used to be working in school, I used to support children with that needed to help manage the behaviour. All of that sort of support is gone. I think policy as well has indirectly led to this. And why do I say that? In terms of government policies and league tables and the expectation on school, there's a real drive on academic achievement and levers, and actually not thinking about what schools have to do underneath that to make sure that children's health and well-being and all of their needs are managed alongside that. So there's a real challenge on that as well. You talked about off-rolling. I think that's a big challenge. When I started at the Local Government Association, that's one of the first interviews I gave, was talking about off-rolling. And it's we as a local authority are looking at what we're doing to manage that. And one of the things that officers do is make sure they have a conversation with every head teacher to understand if that child isn't in school, what are the reasons are around it, and does that head teacher have a legitimate reason as to why they feel that child cannot be in the school, and how that's looked at and how that's managed. And it's having those really robust and challenging conversations, because actually off-rolling is really dangerous, and it's looking for those key markers. All of a sudden, if it's exam time, does a group of children automatically go missing from the school? Is there a vacation? All of a sudden, there's a pot of money for those children to have, for example, a school activity. It's managing all of those things. One thing that hasn't been said is the effect of exclusions from children. How does that child feel when they are taken out of the school environment? Now, I used to be assistant head teacher, so this isn't about telling children that that's not acceptable. Believe you me, if the child demonstrates unacceptable behaviour, there is a conversation to be had. But actually, when we exclude children and their welfare and actually their education is at risk, I think we have to think differently about what we do in those situations. So there needs to be a better dialogue with central government that actually the system that is working at the moment doesn't work for children, and we have to think about those children that are vulnerable, how we can better maintain them in the education system.
Thank you, Anntoinette. Pat, special needs.
Right, yes, because you mentioned a number of...
What I didn't say locally, what we're doing to tackle that, I think that's important to say that. We have got a group of head teachers that are working on exclusions and looking at how we can better support children and schools in that situation. And there's a disproportionality around young black boys being excluded. And as a local authority, we have a programme on improving outcomes for young black boys, and that's something that we're looking at as well. But also monitoring other ethnic groups, whether it's free school meal, whether it's English white boys, because what we don't want to do is we as a council wait till it's a difficulty before we monitor it. So at the moment, white working class boys are not highly excluded within our local authority, but we want to monitor it because we know nationally that they underperform.
Thank you. Pat.
Right, so I agree with what's already been said, but one of the issues for many children who are excluded from schools is their needs aren't being met, you know, often they're children who've accumulated a lot of risk factors, and I don't think it's just about individuals. I think you can look at this at the individual level, at the community level in terms of schools, but also at a societal level. But just looking at individuals, because they're the children who actually suffer, it's very easy to identify those children very, very early on, and that's when we need to actually step in and do the important work. So early intervention, and I think the earlier age the better. So sometimes going even to you know, the early months when mother and child are developing attachment relationships is important before they even get into early years settings. And all the time, I have to say, I think society is expecting schools to do a hell of a lot more with a lot less, whilst every other service is being squeezed. Many of these children or their families would benefit from sort of long-term support from social care or other therapeutic services. But increasingly, they're having to work in the kind of a sort of a episodic sort of a way, you know, with regards to incidents, rather than looking at long-term support for those children. And I think some children reach a certain breaking point, and schools do as well, where they feel they haven't got the resources to meet the children's needs, and then they're pushed out. And outcomes for those students are very poor. They're often children who get involved in serious peer-on-peer abuse, with dreadful results. So I would say that early intervention, identification, assessment of children who may have risk factors, but also shoring up resources in communities. And we have to work as a Labour Party for societal change to actually address the balance of, in very impoverished and marginalised communities who are really feeling the squeeze. A lot of them don't feel they've got any hope, any stake in society, and that feeds into all of this.
Okay, thank you. Just before we take it out to the audience, Daniel, do you want to say?
I think much of what I was going to say has already been said, but I think what has been missed out is that although sometimes parents might choose to home educate their children, sometimes it's actually because they're forced to, both by their kids, because their kids no longer feel like they're able to cope with the pressures of school, both the mental health impacts of the new GCSEs. I have friends who have passed out in exams, had panic attacks, started crying in the middle of exams, wet themselves, soiled themselves, and this happens, and we've got GCSEs in a few months, it will happen again. But also that sometimes schools will encourage parents to home educate, and they'll try and push them down that path, because that doesn't show up on exclusion rates. Officially, there are 6,000 kids who are excluded, according to government statistics. But actually, there are 48,000 students nationally who are in alternative provision. And actually, after a student's been excluded, it costs the government £2.1 billion for every cohort. It costs the government £2.1 billion for the criminal justice system and the health system and so on. That's the knock-on effects. And also some of the things that we don't tell parents when they're pushed down that route is that there are further costs that the school don't explain. When you take GCSEs, you have to pay to enter your child into each one. And parents aren't told about that. And quite often the parents who push down home education can't afford that. And so I think we need to, the solution to it, I think, is it's funding. It's funding. My school has lost £1.6 million in the last 4 years. Hackney has lost £38 million. 38.5 million pounds. And of course, that means that schools no longer have the provision, and so then they force students out through the back door.
Okay, thank you.